brethren, gather close in this shadowed chapel, where candlelight flickers upon ancient wood like the last breaths of the damned, and the rain whispers ceaseless over forgotten graves outside these hallowed walls. I stand before thee, hands trembling over this worn Bible, my voice resounding like thunder wrapped in prayer, confessing a tale of southern sin that echoes through the fog-shrouded plantations of old. Behold, on a humid August morning in the year of our Lord 1855, a child, pale as the moon's ghostly veil, ascended the auction block in Charleston, South Carolina, amidst the stifling air thick with the scent of brine and bondage. Not a soul among the throng desired to claim him, for his skin gleamed cursed, his colorless eyes pierced like omens of divine wrath, a bearer of ill fortune that could blight fields and summon storms upon any master's domain. The bidding commenced at $20, descending swift as a soul to perdition, 15, 10, till at 5, a fan rose, deliberate in the heavy heat. Elizabeth Hawthorne, widow of 4,000 acres, 12 miles beyond the city's spires, bestowed 12 coins in the guise of Christian charity, and the crowd thundered applause for her seeming grace. Yet oh, the deception! For 3 weary years she had hunted such a boy, and none could foresee the 73 souls doomed to vanish upon her lands over 14 tormented years, their agonies inscribed in ledgers consigned to flames by corrupt hands in 1861. One endured, sealed in a foundation wall like a buried malediction, unearthed amid the roar of highway machines in 1959. Pages fraught with measurements, bloodline charts twisted as gnarled roots, and the profane rite known as the Purification Project. Ere we venture deeper into this abyss, where the albino boy's fate entwines with hidden compounds of blasphemy, subscribe to Forgotten Liturgy, and toll that notification bell, for we exhume mysteries the earth itself hath sought to enter. And pray, confess in the comments the state or shadowed city whence thou hearest these laments. We must chart our congregation's haunts. Now let us return to that sweltering afternoon, when a widow's terrible vision took shape like a storm brewing over the bayou. The summer heat in Charleston bore down like the hand of an angry god, pressing upon the crowd assembled near the waterfront slave market, where chains clanked like accusations from the depths, and the air hung heavy with the mingled stenches of sweat and despair. Elizabeth Hawthorne alighted from her carriage, solitary as a spectre in the mist, her massive form commanding attention, an edifice of flesh in an era when such girth proclaimed wealth's abundance and power's unyielding grasp. At 47 years, widowed these 13 seasons past, she ruled her late husband's plantation with a will forged in iron, making overseers quiver like sinners before the altar, and neighbors avert their eyes as if glimpsing forbidden shadows. But what truly set Elizabeth apart, brethren, was not her appearance, nor her mercantile cunning. It was the arcane library she had amassed over a decade's vigil, over 300 volumes on natural philosophy's mysterious ways, the dissection of anatomy's secrets, and the husbandry of beasts, with particular fervor upon breeding techniques and the labyrinthine paths of hereditary science, books that seemed to hum with hymns of forbidden knowledge behind closed doors. The boy dragged onto the platform that day might have seen 11 summers, so thin his ribs protruded through his ragged shirt like the bones of the unburied dead. But it was his coloring that silenced the multitude like a sudden hush in prayer. His skin appeared nigh translucent beneath the harsh sunlight, gleaming as if lit from within by some unearthly fire. His hair white blonde and sparse as frost upon a winter grave, his eyes a pinkish gray that seemed to gaze through men's souls rather than upon their forms. The auctioneer, Cyrus Peaton by name, struggled to conceal his discomfort, his voice faltering as he proclaimed without his customary zeal, "Lot 47, male, child, approximately 11 years, from the Hutchinson estate near Columbia. As ye can see, he bears a particular condition, albinism. The word hung unspoken in the air, yet all comprehended its ominous weight. In 1855 South Carolina, such children carried the burden of superstition heavy as chains among both white masters and the enslaved brethren. Believed to summon crop failures, to behold ghosts wandering the fog, to be marked by divine punishment's brand. The mingling of African and European ancestry wove common threads upon plantations, but albinism wrought uncomfortable ambiguity, defying the racial categories upon which the entire infernal system depended like a crack in the foundation of Babel's tower. When bidding opened at $20, not a single hand ascended. Peyton lowered it repeatedly until reaching $5. Still naught. People turned away, some tracing signs against evil with fingers that trembled like hands over a Bible in storm's fury. That was when Elizabeth raised her fan with deliberate slowness, her expression serene as a graven saint. The crowd pivoted to stare. $5 to Mrs. Hawthorne, Peyton said swiftly, relieved to have any bid. Going once, going twice, sold. Elizabeth stood, opening her purse with theatrical generosity. I will pay $12 for the poor child. It is our Christian duty to care for those whom others reject. Several women nodded approvingly. An elderly gentleman called out, God bless you, Mrs. Hawthorne. She acknowledged the praise with a gracious smile, the very picture of benevolent Christianity. But as the boy was led to her carriage, her eyes studied him with the cold calculation of a naturalist examining a rare specimen. She had finally found what she needed, Subject Zero, for her purification project. The boy, whose previous owners had called him Samuel, sat pressed into the corner of the carriage during the journey to Willowbrook Plantation. Elizabeth said nothing to him, but she opened a leather journal and began writing observations. His approximate age, the specific shade of his skin and hair, the color of his eyes in different light, the size of his hands and feet. She worked methodically, occasionally looking up to measure him with her gaze before returning to her notes. Jeremiah, Elizabeth's driver, had worked for the Hawthorne family for over 20 years. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. He had learned long ago not to question what Elizabeth did. Willowbrook had a reputation among the enslaved community in Berkeley County. People went there and simply vanished, not escaped because word usually spread about runaways being captured. These people ceased to exist as if they had never been born. The carriage rolled through the pine forest toward a part of Willowbrook that Samuel would soon know too well. A collection of buildings hidden nearly a mile from the main house, accessible only by a narrow road through thick woods. These structures had been built between 1843 and 1852 using materials purchased in small quantities from different suppliers across 3 states. The workers who constructed them had been sold immediately after completion, dispersed to plantations so far apart they would never meet to compare stories. When Jeremiah stopped the carriage in front of the largest building, Elizabeth climbed down and beckoned Samuel to follow. The interior was unlike anything he had ever seen. Clean pine floors, whitewashed walls, glass windows. Elizabeth led him to a small room containing a bed with an actual mattress, a chair, a table with a basin, and a shelf. "This will be your room," she said, her cultured voice carrying no warmth. "You will be provided with adequate food, clothing, and shelter. In return, you will cooperate with certain procedures, medical examinations, measurements, observations. Do you understand?" Samuel nodded, understanding nothing except that survival meant obedience. "Can you read?" He shook his head. "Can you write?" Another shake. "You will be taught," Elizabeth said with satisfaction. "You will learn to read, write, and understand natural philosophy. These lessons begin tomorrow. You may ask questions about your lessons, but you will not ask questions about anything else you see or hear. You will not speak to others without permission. You will not attempt to leave. If you obey, you will be treated well. If you disobey, punishments will be severe. Do you understand?" Samuel nodded again, his thin body trembling. Elizabeth locked the door from the outside when she left. Samuel stood motionless for a long time, before finally sitting on the edge of the mattress. He could not lie down. Instead, he sat with his back against the wall, knees drawn to his chest, waiting for whatever would come next. In the cool basement of another building, Elizabeth lit oil lamps and opened a journal. She dipped her pen in ink and began writing in neat, precise script. August 17th, 1855. Subject 0 has arrived at Willowbrook. Initial observations suggest excellent quality for the purification project. Pure albinism evident in all physical characteristics. Begin preliminary measurements tomorrow, followed by educational assessment. Subject 0 represents the foundation upon which all subsequent phases will build. If theories prove correct, this acquisition validates 13 years of preparation. She continued writing for another hour, documenting every detail she had observed about Samuel. To Elizabeth, he was not a person. He was the key to unlocking what she believed were the secrets of human heredity. And she would spend the next 4 years preparing him for a role so disturbing that when the truth finally emerged, it would haunt Berkeley County for generations. Samuel's days at Willowbrook followed a rigid schedule that Elizabeth enforced with absolute consistency. He woke each morning at 6 o'clock when Elizabeth herself unlocked his door, a routine she maintained to establish her complete authority. She would enter with measuring tape and notebook, recording his height against marks on the doorframe. Once per week, she weighed him on a scale imported from Philadelphia. Once per month, she performed a complete physical examination that lasted over an hour, measuring every aspect of his development with clinical precision. After morning measurements, Samuel received breakfast, cornmeal mush, occasionally supplemented with milk or molasses. Elizabeth had calculated precise caloric intake necessary for optimal growth. At 7 o'clock, his education began. Elizabeth had hired a tutor, a nervous young man from Charleston named Christopher Vance, who came twice weekly to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. Vance believed he was participating in progressive research, testing whether enslaved children could learn academic subjects. He had no idea about Elizabeth's broader project. Samuel proved an exceptional student, absorbing information with impressive speed. By the end of his first year, he could read complex texts, write in clear handwriting, and perform advanced mathematics. Elizabeth seemed pleased, though her satisfaction manifested as clinical approval rather than warmth. She assigned him books from her library, anatomical texts with detailed illustrations, agricultural manuals about livestock breeding, natural philosophy books discussing heredity and variation. But the true purpose of his education became clear during Elizabeth's private lessons. She would sit across from Samuel in one of the compound schoolrooms, anatomy charts hanging between them, and explain her theories. She showed him how characteristics passed from parents to children, displayed charts documenting horse breeding, and explained how desirable traits could be concentrated through careful selection. Then she transitioned, her voice never changing tone, to human heredity. She explained her belief that races represented different developmental stages, that characteristics like intelligence and beauty were inherited and could be improved through selective breeding. Samuel listened with his face impassive, his pale eyes fixed on the charts. He had learned that interrupting brought sharp rebukes. Elizabeth never struck him. She did not need to. The isolation and total control she exercised was punishment enough. He was allowed contact with no one except Elizabeth, Vance, and occasionally Jeremiah, who brought supplies but never spoke beyond necessary words.
What Samuel did not yet understand was that Elizabeth was preparing him for a specific role. She was educating him not from progressive ideals, but because she needed him to comprehend what would eventually be required. She needed him to understand heredity, to grasp why certain pairings produced certain results, to appreciate the significance of her experiment. Because eventually, when he matured, he would become not just a subject of observation, but an active participant in creating what Elizabeth called her improved line. The compound held others beyond Samuel, though he rarely saw them. Through his window, he sometimes glimpsed people moving between buildings under escort. He heard voices, occasionally muffled through walls. At night, sometimes there were sounds that disturbed him, crying, screaming, or long silences that felt worse. He learned never to ask about these things. Elizabeth maintained approximately 25 people in the compound at any time, though specific individuals changed frequently. She acquired them through various means, purchasing those with particular characteristics, accepting people other owners wanted to dispose of, occasionally bringing in people from her main plantation when they exhibited traits she wanted to study. These people lived in communal rooms, sleeping on pallets, given adequate food and shelter, but kept in complete isolation from the outside world. Elizabeth maintained detailed records on each person, measurements, health status, family history if known, and specific characteristics she deemed desirable or undesirable. She arranged pairings with cold calculation, keeping charts that tracked which combinations produced children with which traits. Over 13 years, she had documented dozens of births, but the records also showed something darker. A high mortality rate, especially among infants, and numerous disappearances. The truth about these disappearances was perhaps the darkest aspect. When children were born with what Elizabeth called degenerate characteristics, severe deformities or health problems, they did not survive long. Her records noted they failed to thrive or expired due to natural weakness. But witnesses who came forward after Elizabeth's death told different stories. They described infants taken away shortly after birth and never seen again. They described a small cemetery deep in the pine forest, marked only by numbered wooden stakes. They described the copper-lined basement where Elizabeth preserved biological specimens in alcohol jars, including some that appeared disturbingly human.
Samuel knew none of this during his early years. His world consisted of his room, the schoolroom, the examination room, and occasionally the yard, where Elizabeth allowed him supervised exercise. She maintained his health carefully, ensuring adequate nutrition, fresh air, and physical activity, but it was livestock management, not compassion. As Samuel approached his 14th birthday in 1857, Elizabeth's lessons took on new dimensions. She began explaining reproductive biology in explicit detail, using anatomical charts and preserved specimens. She discussed conception, gestation, and birth with clinical precision. She explained genetic inheritance with growing emphasis on his unique characteristics. "You represent something remarkable," she told him during one lesson, her eyes studying him with calculating intensity. "Your albinism is a pure expression of recessive characteristics. If paired correctly with subjects possessing complementary traits, the offspring would be invaluable for understanding hereditary mechanisms. You are not simply a subject to be observed, Samuel. You are the key to the next phase of this research." Samuel was intelligent enough to understand what she suggested, and the knowledge filled him with profound dread. But he had nowhere to run. The compound was surrounded by miles of forest, patrolled by overseers with dogs. Even if he escaped, where would an albino teenage boy go in 1857 South Carolina? He would be captured immediately, returned, punished severely. Elizabeth owned him as completely as she owned her furniture, and the law supported her absolute right to do anything she wanted. But during his recovery from a serious bout of pneumonia in spring 1858, something unexpected occurred. Jeremiah, the driver, began speaking to him during supply deliveries. Brief conversations, never more than a few sentences, always when Elizabeth was absent. Jeremiah would ask how Samuel felt, comment on the weather, mention small details about life outside the compound. These tiny human connections, after years of isolation and clinical treatment, affected Samuel profoundly. One afternoon in June 1858, as Samuel sat in the yard regaining his strength, Jeremiah brought supplies and lingered. "You know she won't stop. Whatever she planning, she won't stop. But you smarter than most. You've been learning from her books. Maybe you can figure something she can't." Before Samuel could respond, Jeremiah moved away. But the words planted something in Samuel's mind. For 3 years, he had been passive, accepting his fate because he saw no alternative. But Jeremiah was right. He could read. He had access to Elizabeth's library. He understood more about her theories than she realized. And if he was careful, patient, and clever, perhaps he could find a way to use that knowledge. As summer arrived and Samuel's health returned, Elizabeth resumed her lessons with renewed intensity. She informed him that the following year, when he turned 15, he would begin the next phase. She had identified several women in the compound with what she called optimal characteristics, and Samuel would be paired with them to produce children that could be studied from birth. She explained this with clinical detachment, as if discussing crop rotation rather than the systematic exploitation of a teenage boy. Samuel listened, nodded, and said nothing, but behind his pale eyes something had changed. He was no longer just a passive subject. He was planning. And as he lay in his room each night, he began to understand that knowledge could be a weapon. Elizabeth had educated him as part of her experiment, never considering that education might give him tools to resist. It was a mistake that would eventually unravel everything she had built.
The autumn of 1858 brought an unexpected complication. Dr. Theodore Sinclair arrived at Willowbrook on October 12 unannounced, carrying a letter of introduction from the Medical Society of Richmond. Sinclair, a rising figure in Southern medical circles, had developed a fascination with hereditary pathologies. He had heard rumors of Elizabeth's private research facility and traveled from Virginia specifically to meet her. Elizabeth received him in the main house, serving tea while assessing this unexpected visitor. Sinclair was 42, tall and thin, with angular features and hands that moved constantly as he spoke. He had studied medicine in Philadelphia before returning to Richmond to establish a practice, but his true passion was research. He showed Elizabeth his published papers on hereditary illness, his theories about racial characteristics, his belief that scientific breeding could improve human stock. The future of medicine lies not in treating illness after it appears, but in preventing weak bloodlines from reproducing. Imagine a world where hereditary diseases are eliminated through careful selection, where each generation is stronger than the last. This is achievable through systematic breeding principles. Elizabeth listened, calculating rapidly. Sinclair represented both opportunity and threat. An opportunity because his medical expertise exceeded hers, and he might advance her research. A threat because he might discover the full scope of her experiments and react with moral objection. Many physicians espoused eugenic theories abstractly, but might balk at practical applications. "Your ideas are fascinating, Dr. Sinclair," she said carefully. "I have maintained some observations of heredity among the enslaved population here. Nothing as systematic as your research, perhaps, but enough to convince me that animal husbandry principles do apply to human beings." Sinclair leaned forward, eyes bright. "I would be honored to see your work. Perhaps I might contribute observations that could advance both our studies." After a long pause, Elizabeth made her decision. "Very well, Doctor. I will show you my facility, but I must insist on complete discretion. The work is scientifically sound, but the general public lacks education to understand its importance." "You have my word as a gentleman and man of science," Sinclair replied solemnly. The following morning, Elizabeth led Sinclair to the compound. As they walked through Pine Forest, she explained her theories and methods in greater detail than she had ever shared. She described 13 years of controlled breeding, meticulous documentation, attempts to isolate and predict hereditary traits. Sinclair listened with rapt attention, occasionally interjecting questions that demonstrated his medical knowledge and genuine interest. When they reached the compound, Elizabeth first took him to the building containing her records. Shelf after shelf of journals, charts and diagrams documenting births, deaths, measurements and observations spanning over a decade. Sinclair examined these with growing excitement. "Extraordinary," he murmured, examining a journal from 1847, documenting 3 generations of a family line. "You have maintained consistency across years. The level of detail is remarkable." He paused, reading more carefully. "Though I must say, the infant mortality rate appears quite high, 37% in this cohort alone." Elizabeth had anticipated this. "Weak specimens," she replied smoothly. "Those with obvious deformities or constitutional weaknesses suggesting degenerate heredity. I have maintained detailed autopsy records on each case. The losses, while regrettable, provide valuable data about which characteristics breed true and which represent hereditary failure."
Sinclair nodded slowly, though discomfort flickered across his face, but scientific curiosity overrode moral qualms. "And you have preserved specimens?" They descended into the copper-lined basement, where Elizabeth maintained her collection. Rows of glass jars lined wooden shelves, each containing biological specimens suspended in clear fluid. Sinclair examined them with professional interest, making notes. Most were organs or tissue samples, but several jars contained small, fully formed bodies. Infants no more than a few days old, their tiny faces frozen in expressions suggesting they had not died peacefully. "You conducted autopsies yourself?" Sinclair asked. "I had assistance from a physician in Charleston initially, until he passed in 1851. Since then, I have performed examinations independently. My anatomical knowledge is largely self-taught, but adequate for the purpose. More than adequate." Sinclair straightened, closing his notebook. "Mrs. Hawthorne, what you have accomplished here represents a singular achievement. The scope, duration, and attention to detail are remarkable. You should publish these findings." Elizabeth shook her head. "Publication is impossible. The public would never understand. I am content to continue research privately, advancing knowledge for its own sake. Then perhaps we might collaborate. I could analyze your data, contribute medical expertise, help design additional studies. With proper methodology, we could produce findings that would revolutionize understanding of human heredity." Elizabeth considered carefully. Collaboration meant shared control and increased risk of exposure, but the possibility of achieving true scientific breakthrough was alluring. "Let me show you the crown jewel of the project," she said finally. She led him to Samuel's room. Samuel sat at his table, reading from a medical text. He looked up as the door opened, pale eyes moving from Elizabeth to the stranger. At 15, Samuel had grown considerably, though he remained thin. His white blonde hair was cut short, and his pallid skin seemed almost luminous in the afternoon light. "This is Subject 0, Elizabeth announced, with unmistakable pride. "A pure albino acquired 4 years ago, specifically for this project. I have documented every aspect of his development, provided extensive education in anatomy and natural philosophy, and maintained his health carefully in preparation for the breeding phase." Sinclair stared with undisguised fascination. He approached slowly and spent the next 30 minutes conducting a thorough examination while Samuel sat motionless, enduring the stranger's probing hands with passive acceptance learned over years in the compound.
Sinclair measured, palpated, looked into Samuel's eyes with various instruments. He asked questions about health history, vision, and sensitivity to sunlight. Samuel answered in a quiet, educated voice that clearly surprised Sinclair. "You have taught him to speak properly, and to read. Interesting choice." Elizabeth explained. "Education serves multiple purposes. It allows him to understand the research significance, ensuring cooperation. It provides data on intellectual capacity of albino subjects, and practically, as he matures, he will need to understand breeding protocols sufficiently to participate effectively."
Sinclair straightened. "Participate in development protocols. You plan to involve him in a structured role, essentially, when he reaches an appropriate age. Yes, he is now 15. I intend to initiate the next phase within 6 months, pairing him with carefully chosen individuals to produce offspring for observation from conception through growth." Samuel watched this exchange in silence, understanding with perfect clarity that his fate had just been sealed. The one hope he had harbored, that Elizabeth might postpone or abandon her plans, evaporated. She had found validation from a respected physician who not only accepted her work, but wanted to participate. There would be no reprieve. After Sinclair departed that evening, Elizabeth visited Samuel's room. "Dr. Sinclair is impressed with our work," she said. "He believes we are on the verge of a significant scientific breakthrough. You should feel privileged to participate in research of such importance." Samuel remained silent. "I expect your cooperation," Elizabeth continued, voice hardening. "You have been given advantages no enslaved person could dream of: education, adequate food and shelter, protection from fieldwork brutalities. I have invested considerable resources in your development. The time has come for you to fulfill the purpose for which you were acquired." Still, Samuel said nothing. Elizabeth studied him briefly, then left, locking the door behind her. In darkness, Samuel finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of despair. He was 15 years old, utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare that presented itself as science. And now, a respected physician had validated everything Elizabeth believed, ensuring the horror would continue and escalate. But Samuel had spent 4 years reading Elizabeth's books, studying her theories, understanding how she thought, and he had begun noticing something neither Elizabeth nor Sinclair seemed to recognize.
The hereditary transmission of albinism is poorly understood. By controlling parentage and documenting results across multiple pairings, we can determine whether it breeds true and what other characteristics are linked to it. For the first time, Sinclair looked genuinely uncomfortable. His eyes moved from Elizabeth to Samuel and back. "He is still quite young. Enslaved boys his age father children regularly throughout the South," Elizabeth replied coolly. "There is nothing unusual in this. And unlike field workers forced into casual unions, Subject Zero will participate in controlled, documented breeding for scientific purposes. The context is entirely different." Sinclair said nothing for a long moment. Scientific enthusiasm warred with residual moral sense, but Elizabeth had calculated correctly that intellectual ambition would win. "What assurances do I have that offspring will be properly documented? Without complete records from conception through maturity, the data loses much value. I have maintained such records for 13 years. I have no intention of relaxing standards now. Every conception will be documented, every pregnancy monitored, every birth recorded in detail. Children will be raised here, where development can be observed systematically. You will have complete access to all records." Then I accept your offer of collaboration. I can visit monthly to conduct examinations and contribute medical expertise. In exchange, I ask only that I receive credit when these findings are eventually published." They shook hands on the arrangement.
Their grand theories about heredity, their predictions about which traits would appear in offspring, were wrong more often than right. Elizabeth's charts showed disappointing results, children who did not match predictions, characteristics that appeared or disappeared without explanation. Elizabeth attributed failures to insufficient data or hidden hereditary factors. But Samuel, reading the same books, understanding the same theories, had begun suspecting something more fundamental, that heredity was far more complex than anyone yet understood, and that Elizabeth's confidence in controlling and predicting it was a delusion. This insight gave him something he had not had before: hope. Not hope for escape, which seemed impossible, but hope that Elizabeth's experiment might fail on its own terms, that results might prove so inconsistent that even she would be forced to acknowledge limitations. It was thin hope, dependent on outcomes years in the future, but it was something. And as Samuel lay in his narrow bed that October night, he made a silent vow. He would cooperate with Elizabeth's demands because he had no choice, but he would watch, learn, and remember, and if he survived long enough, if Elizabeth's experiment eventually unraveled, as he suspected it would, he would make certain the world knew what happened in this hidden place. Theodore Sinclair returned to Willowbrook on November 18, 1858, carrying medical instruments, journals, and supplies he deemed necessary for what he called proper scientific documentation of the breeding phase. Elizabeth received him warmly, relieved to have found not just a collaborator, but someone who shared her vision completely. Samuel had been prepared for Sinclair's visit. Elizabeth had explained in clinical detail what would be expected, using anatomical charts and breeding manuals to illustrate procedures. She had selected 3 women from the compound's population, all in their late teens or early 20s, all exhibiting what she called optimal physical characteristics. She showed Samuel their documentation, detailed measurements, family histories, health assessments. She explained he would be paired with each woman in succession, that conceptions and pregnancies would be monitored closely, that resulting children would remain in the compound for systematic study. Samuel listened with his face carefully blank, revealing nothing of the revulsion and terror inside. He understood resistance was impossible. Elizabeth had absolute power over everyone in the compound, and Sinclair's participation added medical authority to her commands. The first woman Elizabeth selected was named Eliza. She was 19, tall and slender, with features Elizabeth's records described as refined type, suggesting mixed heredity favorable for observing albinism transmission. Eliza had been at the compound for 2 years, taken from Willowbrook's main plantation after giving birth to a child Elizabeth wanted to study. That child, a daughter, had been removed shortly after birth. Eliza never saw her again. The experience left her withdrawn and deeply traumatized, though Elizabeth's notes characterized her as simply a compliant subject with minimal resistance.
Elizabeth brought Eliza to Samuel's room on a cold November afternoon. Sinclair waited outside, ready to enter after what Elizabeth estimated would be sufficient time. She explained to both what was expected, her voice carrying no more emotion than if instructing servants on housekeeping. Then she left them alone, locking the door from outside. For a long time, neither moved nor spoke. They stood on opposite sides of the small room, 2 terrified young people trapped in a nightmare. Neither had power to escape. Finally, Eliza broke the silence. "I know you," she said softly. "I seen you from the window sometimes. The white boy she keeps locked up. Been here long as me, maybe longer." Samuel nodded. 4 years. "What she make you do?" "Study, read her books, learn about,"
He gestured helplessly at anatomical charts on the wall. This. Eliza moved to the window. My baby was a girl. Pretty little thing. Mrs. Hawthorne took her away that same night. Told me the baby died, but I heard her crying for days after in some other part of the building. Then I didn't hear nothing no more. Her voice was flat, drained of emotion by grief too large to fully express. You think that baby really died? Samuel did not answer because he did not know what truth would be kinder. Instead, he said, I'm sorry. Eliza turned to look at him, her eyes holding depths of sorrow. You and me, we got no choices here. She own us. She can make us do whatever she want. So I guess we do what she say, and maybe we survive. That's all there is. What happened next in that locked room will not be described in detail, because some horrors need not be rendered explicit to be understood. It is enough to say that two young people, stripped of all agency, tried to retain some shred of dignity in an utterly degrading situation. When Elizabeth unlocked the door an hour later, followed by Sinclair carrying medical instruments, both Samuel and Eliza had been changed in ways that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. Sinclair conducted an examination of Eliza that was invasive and humiliating, documenting everything in his notebook with clinical precision. He discussed findings with Elizabeth as if Eliza were not present, using medical terminology that dehumanized her completely. Then he dismissed her, and she was escorted back to her sleeping quarters. Samuel remained, and Sinclair subjected him to similar examination and questioning, recording observations about his physical response, emotional state, and comprehension of what had occurred. Elizabeth and Sinclair repeated this process with the second woman, Sarah, on November 25th. Sarah was 18, at the compound only 6 months, purchased from a plantation near Columbia because Elizabeth's records indicated desirable hereditary traits. Unlike Eliza, whose trauma produced resignation, Sarah's manifested as rage. When Elizabeth explained what would be required, Sarah refused outright, voice shaking with fury and fear. You can beat me, sell me, kill me, but I ain't doing this. This ain't right, and you know it. Elizabeth remained unmoved. You have no right to refuse. You are property purchased specifically for this purpose. Your cooperation is required. Then you're going to have to force me. Elizabeth nodded to the overseer. Take her to the isolation room. No food until she reconsiders.
Sarah was locked in a small, windowless basement room, receiving only water and a single small piece of bread daily. She remained there for 6 days. On the second day, Elizabeth visited to ask if she had reconsidered. Sarah, weakened but defiant, refused. On the 4th day, Elizabeth visited with Sinclair, who explained in medical terms the damage prolonged starvation would cause, emphasizing permanent harm she was inflicting on herself through pointless resistance. Sarah wept but did not relent. On the 6th day, Elizabeth took a different approach. She brought Eliza to the isolation room and made her describe what had happened, emphasizing that Eliza had survived, had not been physically harmed, that continued resistance would only prolong Sarah's suffering without changing the outcome. Eliza, exhausted and broken, delivered this message as instructed, though her voice carried an apology Elizabeth had not scripted. Sarah finally surrendered. She was too weak to walk, so the overseer carried her to Samuel's room, where the process was repeated. Sinclair documented everything with clinical detachment, noting that the subject's physical condition was compromised by the resistance period, recommending improved nutritional preparation for future pairings. The third woman, Hannah, witnessed what happened to Sarah and offered no resistance when her turn came in early December. She was 21, at the compound for 3 years, and had learned long ago that survival meant absolute submission. She complied with everything Elizabeth demanded, her face an expressionless mask, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. Afterward, Sinclair noted with satisfaction that the subject demonstrated optimal compliance, suggesting effective conditioning protocols.
Samuel endured these weeks in a state of numb dissociation. Each night, locked in his room, he stared at the ceiling and tried to separate his mind from his body to preserve some core of self that remained untouched by what Elizabeth forced him to do. He read obsessively, losing himself in anatomical diagrams and breeding charts, anything to avoid thinking. And he watched Elizabeth's records carefully whenever he had access, noting growing discrepancies between her predictions and actual results from previous experiments. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was triumphant. She had successfully initiated the breeding phase with Subject 0, documenting every detail with Sinclair's assistance. She calculated conception probabilities, estimated gestation periods, planned observation protocols for the pregnancies she anticipated. In her journal, she wrote extensive entries predicting that offspring would provide unprecedented insights into albinism inheritance. But nature had its own plans. Of the three women, only Eliza conceived. Hannah and Sarah's bodies, stressed by trauma and harsh conditions, did not support conception despite repeated pairings in subsequent months. Elizabeth attributed this to constitutional weakness, noting it as data supporting her theories. She did not consider, or chose not to acknowledge, that profound trauma might affect fertility.
Eliza's pregnancy was monitored with obsessive attention. Elizabeth and Sinclair examined her weekly, measuring her abdomen, listening to the fetal heartbeat, documenting every aspect of gestation. They discussed predictions. Would the child show albinism? What would the skin color be? The eye color? They debated these questions with scientific enthusiasm, apparently blind to Eliza's growing despair as her pregnancy advanced. Samuel saw Eliza occasionally from his window, or during brief periods when compound residents were allowed in the yard. Her belly grew through winter into spring. She moved slowly, heavily, her face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper. Once their eyes met across the yard, and Samuel saw grief so profound it stopped his breath. She was mourning her child before it was even born, knowing what fate awaited any baby born in this place. As Eliza's due date approached in May 1859, Elizabeth prepared the compound's medical room with additional supplies. She had delivered numerous babies in the compound over the years, and she approached this birth with particular anticipation. Sinclair arranged to be present, bringing specialized instruments and promising to conduct an immediate examination of the newborn to document initial characteristics. The birth happened on May 17, 1859. After 18 hours of labor, Elizabeth and Sinclair attended throughout, treating Eliza's suffering as an inconvenient but necessary aspect of data collection. When the baby finally emerged, a girl, weighing just over 6 pounds, Elizabeth's first action was not to comfort the exhausted mother, but to examine the infant's skin and eyes under bright lamplight. The baby was not albino. Her skin was light brown, her eyes dark, her hair black. She appeared entirely healthy, crying vigorously when Sinclair conducted his examination. Elizabeth's initial reaction was visible disappointment. After 4 years of preparation, selecting and educating Subject 0, carefully orchestrating this breeding experiment, the primary characteristic she had hoped to study had not appeared in the first offspring. Recessive trait, Sinclair observed, making notes. As expected, requires both parents to carry the characteristic. The mother obviously does not carry albinism genes, therefore offspring shows normal pigmentation. We would need multiple generations and careful selection to isolate the recessive expression. Elizabeth nodded, her mind already calculating next steps. Subject 0 will need to be paired with his own female offspring once they reach maturity. That is the only way to increase the probability of albinine expression in subsequent generations. This child will be designated Generation 1, Female 1. When she reaches approximately 15 years of age, she will be bred back to Subject 0. Eliza, lying exhausted on the birthing bed, overheard this conversation.
The implications were clear enough, even through her pain and fatigue. They intended to take her daughter, raise her in this compound, and eventually force her into the same nightmare Eliza had endured. The realization produced a sound from Eliza that was not quite a scream, not quite a sob, but something more primal, a sound of absolute despair that would haunt Samuel, who heard it from his locked room for the rest of his life.
Elizabeth allowed Eliza to nurse the baby for 1 week, long enough to establish feeding. Then, on May 24th, the infant was removed and taken to a separate room, where a wet nurse, another enslaved woman, would provide care under Elizabeth's supervision. Eliza was returned to the general population of the compound, her body still recovering from birth, her arms empty, her milk drying painfully because she had no baby to feed. The compound fell into a strange, tense quiet after that week in May. The sounds from other buildings ceased almost entirely. Even Elizabeth seemed subdued, though she maintained her routines and continued documenting observations with mechanical precision. Something had shifted. Some balance had broken, though Samuel could not identify exactly what. What no one knew was that Eliza had made a decision during that week when she was allowed to hold her daughter, a decision born from love so fierce it manifested as terrible action. On the 6th night, when darkness was complete and the compound was quiet, Eliza did something that ensured her daughter would never be used in Elizabeth Hawthorne's experiment. The wet nurse found both of them the next morning, Eliza's arms wrapped around the tiny body that had ceased breathing some time in the night. The details were never recorded, the method never documented. Elizabeth simply noted in her records, Generation 1, Female 1, expired due to unknown cause. Subject Eliza subsequently disposed of as unreliable for further breeding protocols. What disposed of meant was never explained in the documents, but Eliza was never seen again in the compound after that day. And in the small cemetery deep in the pine forest, a witness who came forward decades later remembered digging 2 graves that week in May, a larger grave and a smaller one, marked only with wooden stakes that eventually rotted away, leaving no trace that either of them had ever existed. The summer of 1859 brought stifling heat to Berkeley County, and with it came an unexpected visitor who would change everything. Dr. Samuel Hargrave from Atlanta arrived at Willowbrook on July 8th, accompanied by a young medical assistant named Robert Wong. Hargrave had corresponded with Elizabeth about her research after reading one of Sinclair's published papers that made vague references to systematic hereditary studies being conducted in South Carolina. Intrigued, Hargrave had written to Elizabeth requesting permission to visit, and she had agreed, hoping to replace the increasingly unreliable Sinclair with a more stable collaborator. Robert Wong was 24 years old, the son of immigrants who had come to San Francisco during the gold rush before eventually settling in South Carolina. He was assisting Hargrave with research for a book on human anatomical variation across different populations. Wong approached the visit to Willowbrook with professional curiosity, expecting to see interesting documentation of hereditary patterns. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. Elizabeth gave them the same tour she had given Sinclair, the records room with its shelves of journals and charts, the basement with its preserved specimens, and finally the introduction to Subject 0. But where Sinclair had responded with scientific enthusiasm, tempered by growing unease, Wong's reaction was immediate and visceral horror.
As Elizabeth outlined her methods, detailing the controlled pairings, the systematic monitoring, and the high infant mortality rate, Wong's face grew increasingly pale. When she explained her plans to involve Samuel with future generations as part of her study, Wong could no longer hold his tongue. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said cautiously, his voice strained with suppressed emotion, "what you describe is not science. It is a calculated injustice. These are human beings, not tools for experiment. No knowledge can excuse such disregard for their worth.
Elizabeth tensed, her cheeks flushing with anger. "You are young and swayed by naive ideals that have no place in serious inquiry. These individuals are my legal property under the law, and I have every right to oversee their care and development to advance human understanding. Your personal objections hold no weight." "The law does not define right from wrong," Wong responded firmly, undeterred by the risk of challenging a powerful woman in her own domain. "What is permitted can still be deeply unjust. History will look not kindly on this, Mrs. Hawthorne." Hargrave attempted to intervene, but Wong stood resolute. "No framework of theory supports treating people as mere subjects of study. I've seen enough. I will not be part of this, and I urge you, Dr. Hargrave, to step away as well." Elizabeth demanded they leave her property at once. They departed within the hour, though not before Wong had a brief, meaningful encounter. While waiting for Hargrave to gather his things, Wong wandered down a hallway and paused at a small window in a door. Inside, he saw a pale boy seated at a table, absorbed in a book. The sight stirred a deep sadness in him. He tapped gently on the door. The boy looked up, startled. Visitors were unheard of. He approached cautiously. "What is your name?" Wong asked through the window. "Samuel, sir." "How long have you been here?" "5 years, sir." "Would you like to be free?" The question caught him off guard. After a moment's hesitation, he whispered, "Yes, sir." Wong nodded, etching the boy's face into his memory. "I will remember you, Samuel. I promise." Hargrave's call interrupted, and Wong had to leave. Samuel watched through the window as the men departed. He didn't grasp the full meaning of their exchange, but a flicker of hope sparked in him from the compassion in Wong's eyes. On their journey back to Atlanta, Wong and Hargrave debated heatedly. Hargrave initially defended Elizabeth's work with academic arguments, but Wong's unwavering conviction gradually swayed him. By the time they reached Atlanta, Hargrave conceded that the practices at Willowbrook crossed ethical boundaries, though he declined to act against her. Wong, however, was determined. Within days he began drafting letters to medical societies, abolitionist groups, and newspapers, outlining his observations at Willowbrook with meticulous detail. He recorded the controlled conditions, the preserved samples, the structured oversight, and, most crucially, described Samuel, the pale boy confined and destined for a troubling role in the ongoing study.
The response was not what Wong hoped. In late 1859, with sectional tensions building toward war, most institutions were unwilling to investigate the internal operations of a South Carolina plantation, especially on the word of a young Chinese medical assistant making extraordinary claims against a wealthy white woman. The medical societies thanked him for his concern, but took no action. The newspapers declined to publish his accounts, citing lack of corroborating evidence. Even abolitionist groups, though sympathetic, had limited resources. Frustrated but undeterred, Wong made a decision that would prove fateful. On December 12, 1859, just days after John Brown's execution sent shockwaves through the South, Wong traveled back to Berkeley County. He did not approach Willowbrook directly. Instead, he began quietly interviewing people in the area. Drivers, tradesmen, overseers from other plantations, free blacks in Charleston who might have heard rumors from enslaved people at Willowbrook. Slowly, carefully, he assembled testimonies that corroborated his observations. Elizabeth learned of Wong's investigation in late December when an overseer from a neighboring plantation mentioned that a Chinese man had been asking questions about Willowbrook's slave population. Elizabeth immediately understood the threat. She had maintained her compound in secrecy for 14 years through isolation, intimidation, and the general unwillingness of anyone to interfere with a plantation owner's business. But Wong represented something new. An outsider with no financial stake in the system, no social connection to South Carolina's plantation society, and a moral conviction strong enough to override practical concerns. Elizabeth's response was calculated and ruthless. She could not simply have Wong killed. His disappearance would attract exactly the attention she needed to avoid. Instead, she began destroying evidence. She burned journals containing the most damning details, disposed of the most disturbing preserved specimens, and reduced the compound's population by selling people to distant plantations where they could not easily be questioned. Most significantly, she made preparations to relocate Samuel entirely, possibly to property she owned in Alabama. But Elizabeth had made a critical error. In her haste to eliminate evidence, she failed to account for Jeremiah, her longtime driver, who had witnessed 14 years of horror at Willowbrook and had finally reached his breaking point. Jeremiah had seen Eliza and her baby buried in the forest. He had transported countless people to the compound who were never seen again. He had delivered supplies for Elizabeth's experiments and remained silent because he believed he had no choice. But Wong's investigation gave him something he had not had before: hope that someone might actually listen. On January 15, 1860, Jeremiah made contact with Wong through an intermediary in Charleston. They met secretly in a warehouse near the docks. Jeremiah told Wong everything he knew: the hidden compound, the forced breeding, the high mortality rate, the cemetery in the forest with its numbered stakes. He provided names of people who had disappeared, dates when they had been taken to the compound, details about Elizabeth's methods and her obsessive documentation. Most importantly, he drew a map showing the location of the compound and described how to access it without being detected.
Wong now possessed supporting testimony from someone with years of experience inside Willowbrook. This was the critical evidence needed to compel authorities to take action. He journeyed to Charleston and presented his case to the county sheriff, William Pritchard, laying out his observations, Jeremiah's account, and the physical remnants still present at the compound despite Elizabeth's attempts to destroy evidence. Pritchard faced a challenging dilemma. Elizabeth Hawthorne was wealthy, influential, and deeply connected. Pursuing an investigation based on claims from a Chinese medical assistant and an enslaved driver risked ruining his career if the allegations proved unfounded or overstated. Yet, Wong's detailed and precise documentation suggested that even a fraction of the truth could not be overlooked without implicating Pritchard himself in inaction. On January 23, 1860, Sheriff Pritchard, accompanied by 2 deputies and Robert Wong, arrived at Willowbrook with a court order to examine the compound. Elizabeth greeted them at the main house, her expression a mask of icy rage, though she could not defy the legal mandate. She guided them along a narrow path through the pine forest to the concealed buildings, where their findings validated Wong's gravest concerns. The compound's population had dwindled to just 8 individuals, all appearing undernourished and deeply distressed. The records room was mostly cleared, with ashes lingering in the fireplace from burned journals. However, some evidence remained intact: Sinclair's meticulous medical notes, which recorded controlled pairings and developmental observations with clinical detail. The basement still housed numerous preserved samples, including several unmistakably human infants. Most incriminating of all, they discovered Samuel, locked in his room at 15 years old, capable of recounting the full scope of his 5-year ordeal. Pritchard was stunned. He had anticipated evidence of harsh conditions or questionable oversight, but the organized nature of Elizabeth's endeavor exceeded his worst expectations. He placed her under house arrest, pending formal charges, and ordered the compound's closure. The 8 remaining residents were relocated to the county poorhouse temporarily while their legal status was assessed. Samuel, given his unique situation and potential as a witness, was placed under the court's protection. Elizabeth's response was swift and strategically calculated. She retained the most skilled lawyers, experts in defending plantation owners against allegations of mistreatment. Their approach was straightforward. All of Elizabeth's actions were permissible under South Carolina law. Enslaved individuals were considered property, granting owners complete authority over their care, living arrangements, and management.
The law explicitly permitted everything Wong and Pritchard accused her of: controlled pairings, medical studies, and even the elevated mortality rates falling within her rights as a property holder. This defense stood a strong chance of success. In 1860 South Carolina, a jury was unlikely to convict a wealthy white woman for legally sanctioned actions regardless of their moral implications.
Wong knew this, Pritchard knew this, and Elizabeth's lawyers knew this. The case would likely be dismissed before it ever reached trial. But then something unexpected happened that changed everything. Theodore Sinclair, the physician who had collaborated with Elizabeth for over a year, came forward. He had been living in Richmond, drinking heavily, consumed by guilt over his participation in the experiment. When he learned of the investigation, something broke inside him. On February 8, 1860, Sinclair traveled to Charleston and provided testimony that corroborated every detail of Wong's accusations. More importantly, as a respected white physician, his testimony carried weight that Wong's and Jeremiah's did not. Sinclair described the forced pairings in graphic detail. He provided dates, names, and specific medical observations. He admitted his own participation and expressed profound remorse. He stated clearly that what happened at Willowbrook was not legitimate research, but systematic brutality disguised as science. His testimony was devastating, and it came from someone the court could not easily dismiss. With Sinclair's testimony added to the evidence, the case against Elizabeth became much stronger. But Elizabeth's lawyers adapted their strategy. They argued that even if everything alleged was true, it still did not constitute a crime under South Carolina law. They were preparing to file motions to dismiss all charges when events outside Berkeley County intervened in ways no one could have predicted. Just when we thought we understood the full scope of Elizabeth Hawthorne's experiments, the investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. If you have been following this dark journey into one of South Carolina's most suppressed historical horrors, this is the moment when everything unravels. Hit that like button if this story has kept you on the edge of your seat. Share it with someone who appreciates true historical mysteries, and make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the conclusion. Now let me tell you how the truth about Willowbrook finally came to light, though not in any way that would bring real justice. In March 1860, as Elizabeth's lawyers maneuvered to have all charges dismissed, Wong made one final effort to expose the full scope of the Willowbrook horrors. He had been investigating one persistent question that no one had adequately answered. What happened to all the people who had disappeared from the compound over 14 years? Jeremiah had mentioned a cemetery in the forest with numbered wooden stakes, but he had never been allowed close enough to determine how many graves it contained. On March 14, 1860, Wong, accompanied by Sheriff Pritchard and 2 deputies, searched the pine forest behind the compound until they found the cemetery Jeremiah had described. What they discovered was far worse than anyone had imagined. The wooden stakes had mostly rotted away, but careful examination of the ground revealed disturbances indicating at least 47 separate grave sites. 47 people buried in unmarked graves in a hidden cemetery, their deaths never reported, their names never recorded in any official document. Pritchard ordered excavations of several graves to determine cause of death. What they found was horrifying. Multiple infant remains, some showing signs of physical deformities, others appearing entirely healthy.
Several adult remains that forensic examination suggested had died of malnutrition or untreated illness, and most disturbing, 3 adult remains that showed evidence of violence, broken bones that had never healed, skull fractures, injuries that could not have been accidental. This discovery changed everything. Elizabeth could argue that breeding enslaved people was legal, that high infant mortality was unfortunate but not criminal. But murder was murder, regardless of the victim's legal status. The evidence of violence in those graves suggested that some people in the compound had not simply died from neglect or harsh conditions, they had been killed. When confronted with this evidence, Elizabeth maintained that she had no knowledge of any violence. She claimed that if anyone had been killed, it must have been the work of overseers acting without her authorization or conflicts among the enslaved people themselves. Her lawyers argued that without witnesses or documentation proving Elizabeth personally committed or ordered any killings, the murder charges could not be sustained. But Elizabeth had not accounted for one person, Hannah, the third woman forced to pair with Samuel, who had survived the experiment through absolute submission. Hannah had been one of the 8 people removed from the compound when it was closed. She had remained silent during initial questioning, traumatized and afraid. But when she learned about the cemetery and the evidence of violence, something shifted in her. On March 22, 1860, Hannah came forward with testimony that would finally break through Elizabeth's legal defenses. Hannah described witnessing Elizabeth personally administering poison to an infant who had been born with severe deformities. She described seeing Elizabeth strike a woman who had refused breeding protocols, hitting her with such force that the woman collapsed and never regained consciousness. She described Elizabeth ordering an overseer to dispose of a man who had become too ill to be useful for breeding experiments. Hannah provided dates, names, and specific details that could be corroborated against the grave sites and Elizabeth's remaining records. Hannah's testimony was given at tremendous personal risk. As an enslaved woman testifying against a white property owner, she had no legal standing in South Carolina courts. Her testimony would normally be inadmissible, but the circumstances were unusual enough and the physical evidence compelling enough that the judge allowed her testimony to be entered into the record, though he made clear it could not alone support a conviction. Elizabeth's lawyers attacked Hannah's credibility viciously, arguing that enslaved people routinely lied to harm their owners, that Hannah's testimony was motivated by resentment over being used in breeding experiments, that nothing she said could be trusted.
The legal battle dragged through March and into April 1860, with both sides marshaling evidence and expert testimony. And then, on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. Within weeks, all attention in South Carolina shifted to the war effort. Elizabeth's case, which had been slowly grinding through the legal system, was indefinitely postponed. Sheriff Pritchard was called up for military service. The judge hearing the case left to serve as a military advisor. The county records office, which had been compiling evidence, closed as staff enlisted or fled. Elizabeth, still under house arrest, but no longer actively prosecuted, saw an opportunity. In June 1861, she sold Willowbrook to a consortium of investors from Charleston, claiming she needed to relocate for health reasons. The sale included all property, except the compound buildings, which Elizabeth had quietly dismantled between April and May, burning what could be burned, burying what could be buried, scattering the evidence across the property. The buyers had no interest in the compound. They wanted only the productive farmland. Elizabeth relocated to Alabama, to a small property near Mobile, and disappeared from public record. The last confirmed sighting of her was in 1863, when a neighbor reported seeing an enormously obese woman living alone in a rundown house on the outskirts of Mobile. After that, nothing. She may have died during the war years, relocated further west, or simply vanished into the chaos of a collapsing Confederacy. No death certificate was ever filed, no grave was ever identified. Elizabeth Hawthorne simply ceased to exist in any official record after 1863. Samuel, the boy ensnared at the heart of Elizabeth's profane rite, found a different path through the storm. When the gates of the compound swung shut in January 1860, he was placed under the court's watchful eye. Robert Wong, burdened by personal duty, arranged for him to dwell temporarily with a Quaker family in Charleston, who abhorred slavery's curse and tended him during the legal tempest.
As war's thunder rolled and the case faded into postponement, Samuel remained with them. The Quakers, Daniel and Abigail Hargrove by name, bestowed upon him genuine kindness, the first since his sale at 11 tender years. They furthered his learning, imparted practical crafts, and above all, regarded him as a soul, not a specimen under glass.
When the Emancipation Proclamation rang forth in 1863, Samuel stood legally free. Though freedom's road for a 17-year-old albino lad amid war's chaos was fraught with peril, he lingered with the Hargroves through conflict and Reconstruction's bitter dawn. He mastered carpentry, his hands shaping wood with skill sufficient to sustain him. In 1869, at 23, he wed Rebecca Williams, a free woman of color, and together they begat 3 children. None bore albinism's mark, all flourished healthy to maturity. Samuel toiled as carpenter in Charleston for over 30 years, living quiet as a prayer unspoken, confiding his Willowbrook torments only to Rebecca, in whom he trusted utterly. Robert Wong pursued his healing arts, yet Willowbrook's shadow remade him. He forsook anatomical studies for public health's cause, laboring to mend the afflictions of Atlanta's poor. He corresponded with Samuel over 20 years. In private journals, he inscribed volumes on physicians' ethical burdens and science's peril in cloaking cruelty. He departed this world in 1892 at 57, still pursued by visions of that accursed compound. Theodore Sinclair never escaped his complicity's chains. He practiced in Richmond, but liquor drowned him, mental torments unraveling his soul. In 1867, he ended his days by laudanum's overdose, leaving a note lamenting unforgivable sins wrought in science's name. His Willowbrook notes, entered as evidence, vanished in war's and Reconstruction's turmoil, never sealed as decreed. Jeremiah, the driver who shattered silence to ignite the inquiry, endured till 1879. He lingered in Berkeley County post-war, freighting goods, known for quiet sorrow, smiles rare as if bearing eternal weight. Departed at 60 approximate, his grave marked simple, silent on his courage against Hawthorne's shadow. The 8 freed from the compound in January 1860 met varied ends. Some perished in war's fires, others dissolved in Reconstruction's chaos. At least 2, Hannah among them, abode in Charleston till the 1870s. Hannah wed not, bore no offspring. She sewed as seamstress, solitary, neighborhood knowing her perpetual sadness, yet kindness to children. Departed 1876, buried as Hannah Freeman in Free Black's Cemetery, gravestone enduring, she survived what should have killed her. Willowbrook's lands shifted owners manifold from 1861 to 1959. Main house consumed by flames 1883, cause veiled. Ground served farming, timber, hunting, fleeting. Compounds pine-shrouded depths forgotten, trees reclaiming, cemetery blending with forest floor.
In 1959, South Carolina decreed highway cleaving former Willowbrook, March surveying unearthed compound foundation. In a sealed wall cavity, a leather-bound journal preserved as if by miracle, sealed from moisture's rot. One of Hawthorne's purification records, hidden, not burned, perchance insurance or oversight in 1861's haste. Journals spanned 1855 to 1859, chronicling Samuel's seizure, schooling, breeding's horror, measures, observations, predictions, and clinical accounts of forced unions chilling. Workers bore it to County Historical Society, uncertain of discovery's weight. Staff read, horrified, summoned authorities, delivered to South Carolina State Archives. Inquiry brief, journal matched records, census, 1860 case documents authentic confirmed, dates aligned, names echoed, descriptions fit ruins. Yet disturbing revelation, suppression systematic post-war. Court records partial destroyed, war alleged, yet some excised deliberate.
Charleston 1860 newspapers bare of case, despite sensation. Hawthorne kins wealth veiled truths, even after flight. Archives classified historic. Access restricted 10 years till 1969. Privacy cited. Content sensitive. Released drew historians on slavery, ethics, antebellum eugenics. Papers analyzed Hawthorne's right as Southern eugenic manifestation. Ethics courses taught as warning. Mainstream history shunned. Disturbing, complex, unfit for simple tales. Samuel's kin in Charleston learned via 1969 news. Samuel deceased 1902 at 56, witnessing children grown, grandchildren born. Confided Willowbrook to Rebecca, she to offspring, veiling worst. Journal public. Grandchildren 50s, 60s, comprehended grandfather's endurance. Debated public speech, declined, established lives amid Jim Crow barriers, fearing notoriety's harm. Kept family law private, shunned Willowbrook discourse. Highway proceeded, foundations documented, raised. Cemetery excavated thorough, 61 remains recovered. Adults, children, infant to elder. Reburied Charleston plot, stone inscribed, in memory of those who suffered at Willowbrook Plantation, 1842 to 1860. May they rest in peace and never be forgotten. This mystery unveils science's tongue justifying cruelty profound, law weaponed against powerless, institutions failing vulnerable's guard. Hawthorne's experiment no aberration, extreme of era's accepted attitudes, as enslaved as property, reproduction manipulated, advancement justifying means, ideas not unique, case unusual in system, exposure. What think ye of this chronicle? Did Hawthorne evade justice, or guilt pursue to fate post-1863? Confess below. Share thoughts. If tale compels, seek more dark histories. Subscribe forgotten liturgy. Toll notification bell. Share with appreciator of stories illuminating American history's darkest corners. Gratitude for heeding. Remember, terrors most frightful oft true. Until next. O Lord, in this empty church's fading silence, may these souls' cries find eternal repose, and we repent ere judgment calls. Amen.